So I'm going to talk a little bit about the birth fraternity. I know Brother Whitecamp mentioned before several resources you guys have to look at the fraternity history, and Joe talked about them as well. We have Ray Judice's history that's available, downloadable on the Phi Alpha Delta website. There's also a history video. So when Corey and Aaron asked me if I would do some history presentations, I thought, well, what I'd like to do is give a little P.A.D history and maybe talk about some things that aren't in that history, as well as cover some of the major topics in the history. So tonight my plan was to talk about the birth of Phi Alpha Delta. You all know from our initiation ritual that Phi Alpha Delta found its birth in a legal controversy here in Illinois. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to spend some time talking about the Law Student League, which Ray's history doesn't go into in detail, a little bit about Lambda Epsilon, and then end things with Founders Day. Again, my goal is that maybe even though we have some P.A.D historians on this call, some of them will see some things they haven't seen before, or if they have forgotten. So I've prepared these things to show you, but I certainly hope that you guys will jump in and ask questions, share stories or information you have that I might not cover, because quite frankly, listening to me talk for a half hour, 45 minutes is not terribly exciting, which is the other reason I wanted to share some pictures and other things visually. So let's dig in. Let's talk about that legal controversy. So Illinois became a state in 1818. The original rules for getting admitted to practice in law were basically that you had a certificate of good moral character and you passed an oral examination. The way it was generally done, so we always brag about our big lawyer in that era, Abraham Lincoln, was people who wanted to become lawyers would basically apprentice themselves with a practicing lawyer to read the law. And then they'd get this certificate of good moral character issued by their local court with, they'd have two lawyers who were already admitted, certified to their good moral character. And then the individual county courts each had people they appointed to give this oral examination. So there was no standard examination, there was no standard education, there was no, these are the topics you have to know, or this is what you have to know to become a lawyer. It was all kind of very hodgepodge. This lasted till about 1870. Beginning in the 1870s, the Supreme Court adapted the rules a little bit because they wanted to encourage people to go through a formal legal education. And it changed so that there was a diploma privilege created that if you finished 2 years of formal legal education and you got your certificate of good moral character, you could be admitted without taking any kind of exam. And again, this was to encourage people to get that formal education. The goal being standardizing the education, improving the quality of the professionals who entered the practice of law. Finally, and this is what kind of gives rise to our story, we saw the Supreme Court changing the rules again to do two things. First, they required, before you get your legal education, you have to at least have graduated high school, which had not been a requirement before, believe it or not. Then you had to do not 2 years of legal education, but 3 years. And oh, by the way, regardless of if you go through that formal 3 years of education, you have to take a bar exam, and we're going to appoint statewide bar examiners board who will come up with the exam. It'll be standard across the state. It'll meet certain standards for these are the topics that you have to know. So that was the rule that got things started for Phi Alpha Delta. I want to give you a little more background about Illinois because this shows you why that rule was changed, kind of. Prior to 1870, when there was no diploma privilege, there were 3 law schools in Illinois. One was Union College of Law, which would later become the law school at Northwestern University. McKendree Law School in Lebanon, Illinois, which is this tiny little postage stamp town, and the Law School of the University of Chicago. This isn't the University of Chicago you know. This was a prior University of Chicago that went out of business before the current one started. So there were only these 3 law schools, and again, there was no standardization of what the law schools taught. They were generally 2-year programs because that was considered enough. What happens in 1870 when Illinois adopts this new diploma privilege, boom, law schools start popping up on every corner. Because now all you had to do was say you went to 2 years of law school and you could get admitted to practice law. So now we have all these law schools popping up. Again, there's no standard educational requirements, just that you have to go for 2 years. So there's this explosion of legal education in Illinois. Some of them are correspondence schools that you never even go in person. Some of them have hybrid programs. Mostly they're independent schools, although some of them are programs at existing colleges and universities. But even those programs are small programs that have like part-time teachers that are legal practitioners from the community. And again, now as we get toward the end of I guess it would be the 19th century then, we have the Bar Association starting to say, hey, this is ridiculous. Anyone and their brother can get a law license now, because all they have to do is sign up for a correspondence school that'll take anyone who applies. They don't have to be high school graduates even. There's no quality control, and they get to practice law. So both the Chicago Bar Association and the Illinois State Bar Association actually kind of led the charge that prompted the Supreme Court to adopt that Rule 39 in November of 1897. Now, you'll know there were a lot more law schools then than there are now, and that's because they all started failing once the new rules went into effect. So in November 1897, the Illinois Supreme Court adopts Rule 39. Rule 39, remember, requires that you graduate high school, and they softened up a little bit, and they'll take a high school equivalency exam as well. You have 3 years of legal education, and you take a standardized bar exam to get admitted in Illinois. So we just saw there are now about 30 law schools that pretty much all have 2-year legal programs. And in 1897, a lot of people were already in those schools and had built their plans around the idea that they'd be able to start practicing law at the end of their 2 years. So we have this series of challenges to the Supreme Court. And these are some things I pulled from newspapers back at the time. The first thing up on the left of your screen is just an ad from one of these law schools. This is Chicago Law School, which I focus on a little bit because that's where the Daniel Webster chapter started before it was transferred later to Loyola University. But Chicago Law School and the other law schools you see would post their ads, and the ads say, 2-year courses, diploma admits to bar. So all of these people started their legal education, their 2-year education, thinking, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer in 2 years. In the middle of this legal education, along comes this new rule that the Supreme Court enacts saying, no, we were just kidding. You're going to have to do another year of law school. And by the way, if you start a law school without getting a high school diploma, you might have problems too. So we get these schools start petitioning the Supreme Court to change their mind, basically. Not permanently, but at least to make exceptions for the existing schools. So these are some articles from the local papers. The first article is from Chicago Tribune, and this talks about a petition to modify the rule. And this was 3 of the law schools got together to bring this petition: Kent College of Law, Chicago Law School, and Northwestern Law School. Northwestern, remember, is the old Union College. By now it's at Northwestern University. And again, the argument is we have all these students that have basically planned their life around finishing this 2-year program and then being admitted. We agree you have to up the standards for the bar, but let these guys through, sort of grandfather them in. The Supreme Court sees these petitions and they say, oh, that's very interesting, but we don't care. We have to make the bar better. Why didn't you say something when we were considering these proposals from the bar associations? No, 3 years is going to be the requirement. And around the same time, the American Bar Association, which at that time was not in the business of accrediting law schools and dictating what a legal education required, had also come down in favor of requiring 3 years of law school nationwide. So this last article on the far right, I threw in just because I found it interesting. The Supreme Court gave in on one thing. They said, okay, you don't really need a high school education. We'll waive that requirement if you've already started practicing law, which I thought was interesting. So Joe, when you're talking about undergraduates being part of the fraternity, back then they were all undergraduates, and the law degree was not generally a graduate degree. It was their first degree in college. So the schools themselves try to challenge it, they fail. So now the students decide it's time that we get organized. So we have these groups of students at different law schools who are saying, what can we do? What can we do? We should try to do something. Maybe we can get the state assembly to intervene since the Supreme Court won't give us relief. And these students are actually starting to interact because not all the law schools have law libraries. So the students tend to meet in like the public law libraries. So they get to know students from other schools. This starts happening. In May of 1898, about 6 months after the new rules come into effect, these groups get together and form what they call the Illinois Law Student League. And the Illinois Law Student League's purpose is to get the state assembly to pass legislation that will permit them to be grandfathered in and not have to comply with Rule 39. So we see the league forming and electing officers. Its first president, August Babis, will later be a member of the Joseph Story chapter. Many of these members will become members of Phi Alpha Delta later on. And they start immediately getting to work. Now, if you look at the right side of the screen, I put a little timeline of what the Law Student League accomplishes. And really, it's something quite amazing. So they organize in May of 1898. By January of 1899, they have this legislation being proposed in the state Senate to accept students who had already commenced their legal education before the rules went into effect from having to comply with Rule 39. In February, that act, which came to be known as the Campbell Act or Campbell's Law, was passed in February 1899. The Illinois General Assembly hopped on board, and about 10 days later, they passed it as well with a few minor amendments. The Senate concurred with those amendments, and before the end of February 1899, Campbell's bill became Campbell's Law or Campbell's Act. It was signed by the acting governor of Illinois and became law. All right. So I know what you're all thinking. The work was done. We were successful. All our law students can become lawyers. Doesn't quite work like that because, as we know, the Supreme Court still has to admit them to practice. So the Law Student League still has a little fight left in front of them. So let me talk a little bit before I get onto that fight about some of these leaders of the Law Student League. And a lot of this stuff is stuff you won't see in race history, which really focuses more on the fraternity. But these people are sort of really amongst our founding fathers and I think should be recognized on Founders Day. So August Babis is president of the Law Student League. He is a non-traditional student, unlike the others. He didn't start law school when he was 18. He's actually a career journalist. He's excuse me. He was a newspaper man, a publisher. He got his start in the newspapers in Kansas and then St. Louis, and ends up in Chicago. He's a reporter with lots and lots of contacts. He's one of the get things done guys for Lambda Epsilon. Another guy I want to talk about who was not an officer of the Law Student League, but was chair of their executive committee, is William Lamonte. And William will also later become a Phi Alpha Delta member. Will also has a good set of contacts because before he started law school, he actually served as a member of the Illinois State Assembly. So that's one of the reasons he didn't become an officer of Lambda Epsilon, because he was already serving in the assembly the Law Student League, because he was already serving in the assembly when the Law Student League was formed. So he finishes his term in the Illinois General Assembly and immediately gets to work with his fellow law students because he doesn't want to go back for another year of law school when he graduates. He gets in contact with one of the people he's worked with on other legislation, Senator Daniel Campbell in the Illinois Senate. They do some of this initial work together. He helps Senator Campbell is actually very interested in licensing issues. He's sponsored a lot of legislation in Illinois about professional licensing. I mean, and I don't mean lawyers necessarily, but things like plumbers and hansom cab drivers and things like this. So he's the man to go to. He works with Bill Lamonte and August Babiz to draft the legislation and gets it through the Senate and the Assembly. It gets signed into law. So now our law students have to figure out a way to get the Illinois Supreme Court to listen to them. So they will go and present petitions for all these affected law students to be admitted to practice before the Supreme Court under the Campbell Act. And they know this is going to have to be argued before the Supreme Court. So they go out and they want to find somebody who swings a big stick. So they want to find a very prominent, well-connected attorney to represent them in these petitions. So they find attorney John Hamlin. Hamlin has been an alderman in Chicago. He was president of the Chicago Bar Association. He was, oddly enough, president of the Illinois State Bar Association when they advocated for the new rules. But he is super well-connected, super prominent attorney, and he's going to present the petitions for these students to be admitted under the Campbell Act. So there are 180 applicants that are students who had started their legal education before the rule went into effect. They're presented to the Supreme Court. On April 4th, 1899, John Hamlin and William Barge appear to argue the case for the petitioners. Blewett Lee and A.M. Pence argue in opposition. Now, the opposition is actually mainly made up of professors from Northwestern University, which causes a horrible controversy at the university. Students are petitioning the university to fire these professors because they're hurting their own students, who, even though they were in a more formal university setting, still were planning to practice law after 2 years. But the case gets argued. The Supreme Court takes it under advisement. You've all heard about In re Day, which was the Supreme Court opinion that decided those petitions. Interestingly enough, the original applicant was not Henry Day. It was William Angel, who went to school with Henry Day. And the reason his name doesn't appear in the opinion is because all this took time, even though the legislation went fast. And of these 180 applicants, 60 of these applicants actually, by the time the petitions went before the Supreme Court, had already finished a third year of legal education, and they sat for the bar in the beginning of June. 60 were admitted under Rule 39, and they withdrew their applications for admission under the Campbell Act. So now when the petition's handed down, it's no longer in the name of William Angel. So on June 19th, 1899, the Supreme Court hands down its decision, published as In re Day. And this ruling says, no, we don't care what the state legislature says, because the state legislature doesn't decide who we let practice before us. We have a constitutional separation of powers in Illinois, and we decide who gets to practice law in our courts. So this is the end of the fight for the Law Student League. Although they accomplished some amazing things in their short year and a half of existence, they ultimately failed to achieve their goal, because although the legislation passed, the Supreme Court did not let them get admitted. So here's a little bit about the members of the Supreme Court that I found interesting. It was actually not a unanimous opinion. 2 members of the court dissented. Interestingly enough, a Magruder, who was Chief Justice of the court at the time and part of the majority opinion, would later have a Phi Alpha Delta chapter named after him. I don't know if she's still on, but I think we had the Justice of Magruder chapter on a little while ago. So the Law Student League had formed. All these students from different schools had come together. They'd accomplished major things. And they liked working together. They liked the fellowship of talking about their problems with students from different schools. They liked the camaraderie. They liked doing this. So even before the Law Student League ultimately failed in its mission, these students back at the schools, while they were waiting to hear what happened, started organizing because they didn't want to lose that once the fight was over. So we have these 5 schools in the Chicago area that are sort of giving birth to Phi Alpha Delta around the turn of the century. And this, as I said, starts to happen even before the Law Student League ceases to exist. So at Kent College of Law, the first chapter of Lambda Epsilon Law Fraternity gets founded in October of 1898, just a few months before Campbell's Act passes. At Chicago College of Law, shortly thereafter, sorry, I didn't. My schedule is going crazy. So at Chicago College of Law in February the following year, the William Blackstone chapter is chartered. And I'm going to get back to those two because it's important. At Illinois College of Law, we see the Joseph Story chapter founded in June 1899, about the time In Re Day gets decided. We see a chapter at Northwestern University getting founded, the Melville Fuller chapter. And my chapter gets founded at Chicago Law School, which is one of these frankly crappy 2-year law schools. The Daniel Webster chapter gets founded at Chicago Law School. The reason I want to focus for a moment on what you see in these different schools is because you'll see a lot of the school names don't kind of match what we know from these chapters. Kent chapter at Kent College of Law ceased to exist a short time after it was founded because Kent College of Law and Chicago College of Law merged to become Chicago Kent College of Law. So William Blackstone chapter sort of absorbed Kent chapter. Illinois College of Law would later affiliate with DePaul University. So Story chapter is now at DePaul University. Northwestern University kept its chapter all the way through. And Chicago Law School, that chapter will eventually move to Loyola University, which is where I went. So the interesting thing about these first 2 chapters, Kent chapter and Blackstone chapter, we have these two chapters of Lambda Epsilon. They get together and say, well, we're going to have multiple chapters. We have to have some way of governing all the chapters. So they create a grand chapter, which is sort of parallel to what we would call our international chapter. So the grand chapter is the chapter where all this chapters assemble together. Oddly enough, shortly thereafter, those 2 chapters merge. So now the grand chapter is really one chapter. And one of the first actions they take is to approve the petition or to approve the chapter at Illinois College of Law, which will become Joseph Story chapter. But they're a little bossy because they are the grand chapter. And now that I'm at this point, I'll switch over from the purple and gold theme because those were not the colors of Lambda Epsilon. Lambda Epsilon's color was scarlet, which I'm trying to approximate here in the screen. And obviously it was Lambda Epsilon, which officially stood for law and equity. Their official jewelry was this 8-pointed star with a black circle with a white circle within that circle, and the Lambda Epsilon letters contained within that circle. Let's talk a little bit about Lambda Epsilon before we move on. And I'm going to stop here just in case anyone wants to comment or have questions, because I feel I've been talking too much and too fast. Anyone at all, please jump in.
You're doing a great job. Just keep going.
All right. So, Lambda Epsilon Law Fraternity. So at that first grand chapter meeting back in June of 1899, where the officers were elected from only Kent and Blackstone chapter, because those were the chapters that existed at the time. We have the first grand chapter officers. They approve the subordinate chapter of Joseph Story chapter, and they adopt the original constitution for Lambda Epsilon, which declared as part of the convention as part of the constitution, that there would be no conventions of Lambda Epsilon until the fraternity reached 12 chapters in total. So Story chapter immediately says, so wait a minute. You guys have established this government. Your chapters are merging. Your law schools are merging. We're the only subordinate chapter, and we don't get any voice in our own government. So Story chapter appoints a delegation to go to the grand chapter officers and basically demand that a convention be held, and we figure out a fair way to run the fraternity so that everyone gets a voice. So that delegation goes to the grand chapter. They present their case, and the grand chapter says, you know what, you're right. We should have a convention. We should redo the way we're doing this. We should figure out the best way to do this. And if there are still some students of P.A.D history on the name, that delegation from Story chapter included Brother John Brown, whose name you may recognize, Brother Shelley Neltmore, who's one of the signers of the Articles of South Haven, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Brother Harry Rhodes. So these are all names that become integral to the founding of Phi Alpha Delta in a couple of years. The first convention of Lambda Epsilon is held in December of 1899, less than 6 months after Lambda Epsilon declared it would not have conventions. And they organized, they elected new grand chapter officers, which included at least one representative from Story chapter this time. They adopted that fraternity flag and the fraternity jewelry we talked about, and they sort of got going. So, from having no conventions until they had 12 chapters, they immediately again started saying there's still problems with the organization. We're starting to expand now. We've added the Melville Fuller chapter at Northwestern, but we still don't quite have it right. We ought to get together and play with our governing docs again. As you can tell, this playing with our governing docs is a theme for the fraternity for over 100 years. So a second convention of Lambda Epsilon is called. This will be its second convention in basically a year since they decided not to have any conventions at all, a year and a half. And this convention meets first at Brown Lake in Lake County, Illinois. Now, I know we had someone mention the convention at Conroe, which was officially the convention at Houston that Phi Alpha Delta had back when I was still a young man. And we had some horrible conditions because the air conditioning went out at the hotel. This convention was outdoors, and they were meeting in tents and sleeping in tents at night. So they're having horrible problems. They somehow managed to elect new officers, but they don't get anything else done because the heat is unbearable. They're plagued by mosquitoes. You can see in some of the pictures, their meetings are outside in the woods, basically. For some reason, a lot of them are riding around on donkeys. We don't really know why. We might not want to know why. Maybe that's something that should stay at convention. But they don't get anything done, so they say, you know what? We're going to adjourn the convention, but with a second session, which will be held back in Civilization in Chicago in April of next year. They decided it'll be the same delegates who served at the 1901 convention. They'll just reassemble, and we'll deal with the governing docs problems then. So they have that second session in Chicago. Needless to say, they do not solve all of the young fraternities' problems. So they have to have, so they start planning, all they basically do is plan the next convention. By then we have another chapter added to the roster, Webster chapter, which technically is the 5th chapter of Lambda Epsilon, but remember 2 of them merged, so there are only 4 chapters at this time. So they planned the 3rd convention of Lambda Epsilon, which is going to take place in South Haven, Michigan. We're not going to camp outside this time, though. We're going to go to the Colonial Hotel. I'll say a little bit about the Colonial Hotel, or the Colonial Tavern, which it's referred to in the official history, because we place our importance on the tavern, not the hotel itself. But this is this brand new hotel in South Haven that's just opened that year. This picture that I have on the left here is not as the hotel appeared in 1902, because the hotel had been immediately plagued by problems. At the end of that season, the hotel went bankrupt, was taken over by new people. There was a fire that burned at the hotel. So the picture here is actually from 1912. The hotel has now been rebuilt. They restored the decks, but it's 1 story shorter, and the cupola top, which is where the meetings of the last fraternity took place, is no longer there. The picture to the right is from 100 years later, after 2 additional fires and rebuilding. This picture is from 2012 and was taken by me when I visited the site of the Colonial Hotel with our current international justice, Brother John McKell. We took that picture. It's actually still there, although it's been rebuilt a couple times. The cupola has been added back. That big grand balcony is now gone, but the cupola has been added back, although slightly smaller than it originally was, and the 4th floor has been added back to the hotel. So it's closer to what it originally was, less than the deck, minus the deck. But aside from the history of the Colonial Tavern, the convention itself is probably not what people wanted to see. They'd been trying to fix the governing docs for 3 years now. No real progress had been made. Everyone kind of went, they were dissatisfied with Lambda Epsilon. My poor chapter, Webster chapter, had just been chartered. This was their first convention, and things were already falling apart. So there was this massive debate, but eventually a resolution was introduced and passed by the convention that dissolved Lambda Epsilon fraternity. So after its short and turbulent history, by summer of 1902, Lambda Epsilon has died. But now all these people are sitting there in South Haven, and they still wanted a fraternity. They just didn't like the way that one had turned out. So they went ahead and they're going to start a new fraternity, sort of built on the ruins of the Law Student League and Lambda Epsilon. Now we go back to our familiar purple and gold. This will be Phi Alpha Delta. So what you see on the screen now are what we now call the Articles of South Haven. At the time, they were called the Articles of Organization. This is obviously a very short document. It doesn't even give the name to the new fraternity. It talks briefly about the board of directors and the officers that will serve, but these people have not been elected, of course. And it's signed off by all these delegates from Lambda Epsilon, who will become our founding fathers and chartered members, the signers of the articles. So you see that list there. It's representative of all the 4 chapters of Lambda Epsilon at that time. And as a special treat, because I like to brag a little bit, some of you may have been to the executive office and seen what you thought were the Articles of South Haven hanging on the history wall there. Those are actually a replica of the Articles of South Haven. These are the original Articles of South Haven, which have remained in Chicago for the 118 years since they came back from that convention. I am the 4th custodian of the Articles of South Haven. Each custodian is charged with selecting a custodian to succeed him, and they're entrusted with the Articles of South Haven, the original charter of the Chicago Alumni Chapter, and the first coat of arms that were ever struck for Phi Alpha Delta. And they're charged with one thing. You will be entrusted with these items, but they cannot leave Chicago. We're specifically told, we don't know where the executive office is going to be at any given time, but these stay in Chicago. So some of you heard me tell my story earlier about how I got involved in researching Chicago, the history of Phi Alpha Delta and reaching out to all the older alumni in Chicago. One of those alumni was Chuck Falkenberg, who I'm sure many people on the call know. Chuck was the third custodian of these items. He invited me over to his house. He gave me a number of pictures and he talked to me. At the end of that conversation, somehow I satisfied him, although I was still a student at the time, that I should be the next person entrusted with these articles. He had gotten them from Brother John Brown, Story Chapter, who you may remember was on that original committee to the Lambda Epsilon Grand Chapter demanding the first convention. So I have those in my possession now. I have taken them periodically to joint initiations, and I did a history display at the convention that included those and other items one year, and I've done other times where I present them to be allowed to be viewed by fraternity members. So I'm very proud of that. I'm still looking for my successor. I think I have tougher standards than Chuck did because somehow he trusted me, but I take it very seriously. So what happens after the articles are signed? So we have this new organization as yet unnamed. Several of the members there basically start working for the next 3 months. This is a quote from Brother Paul Meyer, who's one of those original founders and a signer. And at the 50th anniversary convention, the Golden Anniversary Convention in 1952, which was held here in Chicago, he tells the story of, or he and other founding members still living tell the stories from when the fraternity was founded. And he relates how after the articles were signed, we labored 3 months. I want to say we met almost every day. And we succeeded hammering out the Constitution, a set of bylaws, a plan of organization, and a ritual. So then in November of 8th, 1902, which has become known as Founders Day in the fraternity, the fraternity at large, as yet unnamed, meets. There are about 50 former members of Lambda Epsilon present, and they adopt this original Constitution, bylaws, and ritual. And this is actually the minute entry from that meeting on November 8th. You can see the minutes don't even mention the name Phi Alpha Delta. They say the Constitution, ritual, and fraternity rules were discussed and adopted, and the meeting adjourned. And that is the birth of Phi Alpha Delta. That's Founders Day. Roland Hollick chaired that meeting, a member of Fuller chapter. He was the last Right Honorable Chief Justice of Lambda Epsilon, and he continued in basically to chair things because they didn't have other officers at that time. So that's what we're celebrating this week, Founders Day, when those original rules were finally adopted. Although Phi Alpha Delta is not mentioned in the minute entry, it is mentioned in that original Constitution. So this is considered the birth of Phi Alpha Delta.